Hi there, I'm Steve Bauer, North End District County Commissioner, and I want to welcome you to Commissioner's Corner. Today I want to talk about something that's a real passion for me and I think for all of us, and that's water. Whether it's the salt water in Puget Sound or Hood Canal, or it's the fresh water that we rely on every day in our streams or in our taps, it's really a critical and defining issue for us in the county, and it's under threat. And so we're going to cover a lot of territory here in a half hour, but I think it's really important, and I hope that you will too. The first thing that I want to do is try and challenge your assumption about this county that we live in. We tend to think of it as a peninsula, but in fact, I want you to think of it for a minute as an island. And as my sister told me this morning, I shouldn't give up my day job. I'm not going to be doing any artwork, and that's okay. But if we think of ourselves as being on an island, that old thing of the guy there on a stranded and desert island, if you had rain and it came down, you'd do everything you could to protect that rain, and you wouldn't be throwing any fresh water away because you'd really rely on that for living. And that's our situation in this county. That we, even though we live on a peninsula, because we don't have mountains like the Olympics or the Cascades for snow melt and a reservoir, surface big rivers to impound to provide water for us, we have to rely on the rainfall that comes down and seeps into the ground to provide the water for us. I think I talked a few months ago about the water cycle, but I want to talk about it a little more today in terms of general background. So what I'll try and do today is to talk about the water cycle, talk about how we deal with stormwater, and talk about how we deal with our sewer plants. Now, why are those important to us? The first thing is that we're throwing away a critical resource. In the stormwater in our sewer plants, we're taking something that we can't replace and we are throwing it away. The second thing is that the impact of that is having a real effect on Puget Sound and Hood Canal. And the third is that it's damaging our streams, it's damaging our fish runs, it's causing problems and flooding, and all of those are worth us taking some time. So you all know from high school and maybe grade school the water cycle, but remember that the water comes out of the streams and the rivers, in this case the Puget Sound and the ocean. It evaporates up, it forms clouds, it comes over, and then it precipitates back down in terms of snow or rain. Now, in the case of the Cascades and the Olympics, that means it goes into snow, it sits there for months and slowly meters out, feeds the streams, that feeds reservoirs, that feeds both the streams themselves and the use by humans of that water. In our case, it has to go into the ground and recharge aquifers, sort of lakes that are underground, that are built up over generations that provide the water that we rely on for all of our domestic uses and all of our commercial uses in this county. So this is really important for us. And I want to talk a little about what the natural system looks like. We talked about this before, but it's really worth spending some time looking at it. If we had forest land, what you can see in the slide on the screen will be clearer than this one is, but when the rain comes down, you get about 37% of it that goes back up in evaporation off of the leaves and everything, and the trees and the foliage actually transpire water into the air. So you get about 37%. And then you get about a quarter of it, about 25%, that what's called interflow. It's just subsurface following the terrain that comes down and gradually, over time, feeds the streams and leaches out into the salt water or the rivers. About a third, more than a third, of the water goes down into the ground and feeds our aquifers and replenishes our water supply. This is really critical. And less than a percent, 0.3%, flows on top of the ground to go into the streams and things. So this is fairly important. Most of the water is going into the ground, very, very little of it on top. We're recharging the aquifer that we rely on for our drinking water purposes. Now, what happens when we build a house, shopping mall, it doesn't matter. Well, we've taken away the vegetative cover that does a number of things for us. We cut the amount going back up into the air from about 37% down to a quarter. Remember, we had 36% of that water going back down to feed our aquifers. This is our bank account. So we're taking money out of our bank account every time the rain falls when we have development. 15% goes into the ground. We still have about the same amount coming through interflow, about 30%, but look at the big difference. 30% of that water coming down as rain flows on top of the ground. That's what's feeding into the streams, into our storm gutters and our roads, and causing issues like flooding in the stormwater. And this is what we deal with as society when we do this development, because we've taken away the vegetation, we've planted even grass that doesn't slow this down and allow it to seep down. So this is a major change in terms of how the water behaves compared to the natural environment. So we treat this part as stormwater. Now historically what we've done is from when I was a kid, we just dig ditches to the big ditch that was alongside the road. We've gotten a little more sophisticated over time. We put it in pipes now. We have grates and vaults that contain the water and then feed it out into pipes. But where do we put those pipes? We put them into streams. We put them directly into Puget Sound and Hood Canal. And that's millions of gallons a year that are going one way or another out into Puget Sound and Hood Canal. This issue of only 15% going into the groundwater is really a big question. How long can we continue to have population growth in this county if we're not replenishing our bank account? And just the last week or so, the paper reported that all of the water sellers and providers in the county agreed to invest $1.5 million over the next 5 years to really look at this issue. Are we going to have enough water for future growth? What do we have to do to conserve that water? So this is really important. So what happens with this 30%? Well, one of the things that happens is that we get significant flooding. And if you look back at 2007, everything from Point No Point Road, which was totally underwater, the Chico Bridge, which washed away, a mobile home on the edge of Chico Creek that was undermined and fell into the creek, another culvert that was totally overwhelmed. We had a culvert in Illahee wash out, and it took us months to rebuild that. What happens is, and what we heard from people after that flooding, is this 30%, because it's running on top of the water, instead of going under the ground like it used to. Here, when you'd have a rainfall and this water would flow here, it would sometimes take days for all of it to reach the stream. So you'd find a very slow process of the stream rising gradually, so you didn't get flash floods. That's what we get now. 2007 was extreme, but if you talk to people who live on the streams around this county, what they'll tell you is that what they've experienced, if they've lived there for 20 and 30 years, is the difference between a gradual rise over several days after a significant rainfall to getting a flash flood in a matter of hours. That flash flood destroys property. If you remember the 2007 photographs, you'd find all sorts of things that were carried down and dumped out in Hood Canal, including all the silt. It destroys the spawning beds for the fish. So this whole issue of flooding is really important because we have destroyed the natural cycle and because we're piping directly into the streams and into the sound. Now, the other thing that happens is that this slow flow is what fed the streams historically. So that's what we relied on because we don't have snowpack in order to see that we had a consistent amount of water going through the streams. That's really important in terms of fish migration and fish spawning and egg rearing in the streams. It's important because it keeps the stream temperature down, which is important for the fish. So that this whole issue of feeding the streams on a regular basis, we lose when we've got all of this water going across the top. The other thing that it does is that it ends up really polluting Puget Sound and the streams. The Puget Sound Partnership indicates that the single biggest polluter for Puget Sound is stormwater. And we know that Puget Sound is in trouble. We know that Hood Canal is in trouble. The single biggest polluter for Puget Sound is stormwater. And you can see why that would happen. So let me just talk about what's in that stormwater. And this, by the way, is an example of the stormwater. Now, it hasn't been raining this week, so our folks went and got this out of a catch basin. And I thought it was so bad, I called and said, can this be real? Because I've got, let's see, there's a cigarette butt in there, there's some kind of a plastic lid or rings off of something, there's a package, there's another cigarette piece, and there's a bunch of crud and a leaf floating around there. You can see what this water looks like. But what's in it? We know that it's coming off of our driveways, off of our sidewalks, off of the roads, off of roofs, parking lots for commercial enterprises. So we know that there are things like petroleum products, oil and grease and other things that are going into it, but there are a whole host of chemicals that we test for in that stormwater that really have an effect. They would have an effect on us if we were somehow imbibing them, and they definitely have effect on aquatic life. So here's an example of some of the things that are in there. Fecal coliform. This is the bacteria that makes people sick, gives them the gastrointestinal problems that we hear about. A large part of that comes from our dogs, but it also happens with other animals. And again, because we're not filtering that water through the ground, that's going directly into the streams. That's resulted in shellfish bed closures around the county over the years, and we've worked very hard with the health district to try and clean up the streams and the septics that were upstream of them so that we could reopen shellfish beds, but this is a real issue. So let me talk about some of these others, and I'm not a scientist, not an expert, so I don't know about the numbers, but I can tell you about some of the effects of these things. We have nitrogen. That's the stuff we put on our gardens to make things grow. When it gets out into the water, it allows algae and other things to grow that consume oxygen and end up depriving aquatic life of the oxygen it needs. So we've talked a lot over the last couple of years about low oxygen down in Hood Canal, so that's a real issue. Phosphorus, again, helps vegetation grow and contributes to the same problem. That's in stormwater. When we go out and fertilize our lawns, that stuff leaches down into the system and gets out in our stormwater. But what are some of the other things? Cadmium is one of the things that we find in that water. Do you know that's one of 6 substances banned by the EU, the European Union, because of its hazard to people? Copper. That's the stuff that's on the bottom pane in my boat to keep things from growing. So imagine what that's doing, and that comes from brake pads. So imagine what that's doing to aquatic life. Lead. We know about the effects of lead on humans' nervous systems. That's why we don't put it in paint anymore, and we have to go through all sorts of abatement procedures. Nickel. Nickel seems to be at a bare minimum an allergen for people. When they put it on studs for earrings and stuff like that, it would cause all sorts of inflamed tissue. It was named the Allergen of the Year in 2008 by the American Dermatitis Society because of the problems that it causes. And zinc. Zinc is the stuff that we put on our roofs to keep the moths from growing. Something as low as 2 parts per million can affect the oxygen uptake ability of blood for fish. So these are the things that are coming out of stormwater that are going into the bay, in addition to the particulate matter that consumes oxygen as it dissolves. So this is really important in terms of its impact, and it doesn't take a brain surgeon to figure out that this isn't good to be putting into Puget Sound and Hood Canal and our streams. Look at the number of streams that we've got that have signs that say polluted, don't play in the water, so kids don't get to play in the water these days because of this stormwater treatment. Now we'll show you a slide that shows outfalls of the county. The little green dots on this slide are outfalls, pipes that go into Puget Sound and Hood Canal, and these pipes are more than, we're not talking about little ones, these are just the pipes that are more than 2 feet in diameter, and we have more than 90 of them in the county. And the cities would have beyond that. So think of the amount of water of this material that's going out into Hood Canal and Puget Sound. So this is the stormwater sample. My question to you is, would you drink this? I don't think so. But we're putting it out into the sound. So the next question, my good buddy, one of my favorite TV programs, Nemo. If you had your aquarium, would you put this in the aquarium with Nemo? I don't think so. But we're putting it out into Puget Sound and we're putting it into Hood Canal when we wouldn't use it for any of these kinds of things. So this is some salt water out of Puget Sound I took yesterday. A little bit of seaweed in there. Just going to pour, let's see, there goes the cigarette butt and a bunch of other things. This is what we're doing when we're putting that storm water out into Puget Sound and Hood Canal. And it has the chemicals and the other things in it that we've talked about that have those kinds of effects. So the question is that really okay? We know it isn't because of the effect it has on the sound. Okay, so if we wouldn't do that, we wouldn't put it in Nemo's cage, why do we put it in the sound? In the past, because we didn't know any better. And there always is the issue of what are the dollar costs for doing something different. What have we done in the past? We've just piped it. In more recent years, we put stormwater detention facilities. You see those big holes in the ground with chain link fences around it and stuff that allows at least some of the murky stuff to settle to the bottom, but we still get the chemicals and things that are going out into the sound. Recently, we've been looking at other approaches, and the goal here is how do we get back and make our development look more like the natural cycle? That's really the goal, is mimicking the natural cycle. And the Home Builders Association have really been a leader in this county and the state in something called low impact development. And that is, how do you capture this water and how do you get it to go back down into the ground to replenish the aquifer and other things? So there are a couple of things I just want to show you as examples. One of them is something called pervious pavement. Right now, when we have roads and we have sidewalks and we have driveways that are solid concrete or asphalt, the water just rolls off the top and goes in and feeds stormwater. In this case, you can design concrete and you can design asphalt so it's called pervious, so that you can see the water goes right through, goes into a gravel and sand bed, and over time moves back down and re-feeds the aquifer, much like the natural cycle used to do. The other thing that we're doing more and more called rain gardens. So the downspouts, the things that are coming off your roof, your driveway, to build a rain garden. And again, this is a carefully designed garden that has humus and other materials underneath it, natural vegetation on top, so we're getting the evaporation and transpiration coming off the top, but we're also going back down and feeding the aquifer. These are really attractive, and right now the county with Extension and the Conservation District are helping people with advice on how to build these and providing financial incentives. So there's some things that you can do right now. We require these for new construction these days because we're trying to make it more like the natural cycle, but some of this we can do retrofit. Now the Board of Commissioners have adopted a policy called Water as a Resource, where we're really looking at not throwing away this resource anymore, but in new construction and also the existing facilities we've got, the policies we adopt, really talking about recognizing the importance of water to our future and how we preserve it. It'll cost some money to go back and retrofit. One of the biggest problems in this is that we've got new construction, but that's really small compared to all the things that are out there. What are one of the biggest sources? The road system. Who's the biggest owner of that? The county. So we've got a lot of challenges in terms of what we do to deal with that. Okay, so that's stormwater. Now I want to talk for a minute about sewers. When water comes into our home, we use it and it leaves, it goes one of two places. It either goes into a septic system or it goes into the sewer. The septic systems have gotten kind of a bad rap, I think, that they really serve a useful purpose. One of the things that they do is that the water coming out of the effluent coming out of the septic system goes and evaporates into the air and then percolates down through the ground. Organisms and others treat it, and it can ultimately over time recharge the aquifer. So we're containing the water on the site. Now there's some issues around septics and things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and pharmaceuticals that we excrete out of our bodies after we use them. The longer term there are issues about that, but they really make a lot of sense and may be environmentally a useful thing for us to really have in our repertoire for dealing with the water cycle. There's some new technologies that are available that actually make them more benign and provide an effluent that is cleaner than what comes out of them right now. And just as an aside, we've got kind of an irony, I think, that the State Growth Hearings Board, at least in urban growth areas, is trying to tell us that everybody that has a functioning septic over time has to join the sewer system at considerable expense. That system currently takes the water and throws it away into the Sound. So what about sewers? We think about them as modern and safe for the environment, but you know what? They've got their own problems. There are two issues as far as I'm concerned. One is that I believe that the effluent from the sewers contaminate the environment. And the second thing is that we're wasting water. We're throwing that water away that we need to come back and recharge our aquifers. Kitsap County operates 4 sewer plants. The city of Bremerton and West Sound Utility operate an additional 2, so we've got 6. And between them, we're putting about 8 million gallons a day of effluent out into Puget Sound. Now, for the county, for all 6 of them, that 8 million gallons a day, that's 3.2 billion gallons of effluent a year that are going out into Puget Sound. And most of it's treated, it's called secondary treatment. What does that mean? Primary means that just the heavy stuff floats, the floating stuff, the big stuff floats to the bottom, drops to the bottom. Secondary means that you take all of the floating suspended material out, but you still have lots of chemicals and other things in it. And tertiary treatment means that it's virtually drinkable. Our standards, our plants operate on a secondary basis. So for the county, the 1.4 billion gallons a year that we put out into Puget Sound, we are putting over 400,000 pounds of nitrogen into Puget Sound. Now, why should we care? Because that's what contributes to low oxygen demand in terms of what happens in the water. So if you go down in Hood Canal, we've heard about that for years, the low oxygen demand. We've seen it this fall, the fish kills. But in region, I bet you don't know that recently in South Puget Sound, they've been having low oxygen demand there, and they traced it back. And 70 to 80% of the reason for that low oxygen demand was sewer outfalls and this nitrogen that was being put into the water. So we've got nitrogen, we have phosphorus, we have pharmaceutical byproducts that affect the endocrine systems of the fish in the water. So they're not benign. There are real issues. So what does it look like? This is a sample that came from our plant just today, and it's a little murky down in here. This is a couple, 3 days. It sort of starts growing little things in there. And again, the question is, knowing what you know about that, would you drink this? Would you put this in Nemo's tank? Is it okay to be putting this several million gallons a day into Puget Sound? I don't think so. There is a higher standard, and that's called tertiary, and West Sound takes a portion of their system and they treat it to a tertiary standard, and you can see that this is virtually clear. I'm assured it's drinkable. I'm not going to drink it for you, but I'm assured it's drinkable, and we can produce water, not effluent, but water to this standard. It just costs a little bit more. Now, why don't we do it? Just because it costs money. Somebody has made a decision in the past that we don't want to pay for producing a clean product that goes. And so instead, we become polluters. And we become polluters for the same reason industries have, as to keep the product costs down. But I think you can see the impact of this on the environment. So what are some options? Well, we can create to tertiary, and it doesn't cost that much more for the treatment or the operation. There are a lot of benefits. And then we can reuse that water. We can reuse it for irrigation. We can reuse it for industrial purposes. We could, if we clean it enough, actually directly inject that back into the aquifers. This is the technology the space station and others use, and we can do the same thing here if we're committed to preserving the environment. So more of my handiwork here. We're getting close to the end. I think what I want to underscore for you is that there are really, I think, 3 goals that we need to keep in mind. One is that we need to protect Puget Sound and Hood Canal. Second is we need to protect our aquifers. We need to recharge and refill our bank account. And the third is that we need to protect our streams for people to use, for the fish runs, and to prevent flooding and damage to us in the long term. So what can you do in terms of takeaways here? I think there are several things that you can do. If you have a septic system, it's important to maintain it so that it operates properly. Think about putting in a rain garden. All of us can retrofit our yards and benefit from a rain garden, and it ends up being a really attractive piece of the landscaping. Pervious pavement. If you're going to put in a driveway or sidewalk, think about that. It can be asphalt, it can be concrete, it can be pavers. There are a number of options, but all of them have the benefit of not shedding the water, but having it go down into the ground. Doggy bags, and I don't mean leftovers from the restaurant. When we go out there with our dogs to clean up after them and really stop a substantial contribution of fecal coliform to the water. The last couple, one of them is just remember Nemo. Don't put stuff out in the yards, don't put stuff in your septics, and don't put stuff down the drain that you don't want to put in the aquarium with Nemo, because that's what we're doing when we're dumping it or using it in that fashion. And the last is really be prepared to invest in the future by paying the real cost of treating this stuff. Right now, we're avoiding that cost by polluting Puget Sound and Hood Canal and paying the long-term price for our kids and their kids. And we're going to have to be looking at paying more in order to produce this that then is benign in terms of that effect. So I know this has been a lot of information. What I would just remind you is that both how we treat stormwater and how we treat sewer output is really important, that it's part of how we protect Puget Sound, but it's also that we stop throwing away something that is an important resource and critical for our future. We'll show you a slide about some of the places that you can contact for information and advice and help on things like rain gardens, pervious pavement, or even being a beach watcher. But I think this is really critical. It's critical for our future. I know you believe that as well. I want to thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.